Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 643. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. Well, what you can see on the screen here is, maybe some of you know her, maybe some of you don't, but this is Whitney Webb. She's an author, a researcher. The thing she's most known for right now is her book on the Epstein situation, let's just call it. I mean, the reason a lot of people want to just limit the Epstein situation to trafficking, and that is definitely part of the story, but there's more to it. I mean, when you dig into this thing, it just goes in all different types of directions, and it's sometimes it's very difficult to tell what this is all about. But at a minimum, it's about trafficking, it's about power, it's about control, it's about the banking system, utilizing the banking system to corrupt institutions and things like that. So there's a lot going on there. And if you want to know the most about it, pre the Epstein files coming out, Whitney Webb has a 2-volume book called The One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Very highly researched book, footnoted, and she does an incredible job of digging out information where there's really not much information, And so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend that. But from time to time, I go listen to Whitney Webb because she's just, her memory is incredible. I don't know how she remembers all the stuff she does. I guess, when you write a book about something and you know as much as she knows about it, maybe it makes it easier to do interviews and, discuss this kind of thing with people. But it's really extraordinary. And you're going to see that on display here in a second. But, one of the things about the Epstein situation is people will ask me, what do you think it's all about, Seth? And this is almost like a trap, right? Because, this is where people go, oh, come on, it can't be about that, or it's got to be about something else or whatever. And so the financial system is very similar. And this is another thing Whitney Webb knows a lot about. She knows a lot about the financial system. She knows about Bitcoin and CBDC and all these kinds of things. And this is another area where people will ask you, what do you think is going to happen? How should I prepare? And the real answer is, I don't know, right? None of us really know. But I think if you want to get some idea about what could happen, I think Whitney Webb is a good place to start. And, maybe you have your own, and that's fine. But my experience with her is she's honest. She's got good research, good facts, she sees these connections that are, difficult sometimes to spot. And I think that's a unique talent of hers. So I wanted to expose everybody to Whitney Webb today and talk about, the financial situation. Now, we kind of broached this subject a couple of weeks ago when silver ran up to like 120 and then immediately crashed. And we kind of talked about what was going on there. I mean, essentially what happened was there was a forced liquidation. So there's kind of two markets when you look at anything financial. There's the financialization of it, okay, and then there's the actual thing. And the easiest way to think about this is everything falls on a spectrum from a pure good or service that's traded on the market. So think of like bread or Coca-Cola. There's nobody kind of investing in bread or Coca-Cola per se, right? There's only people that produce and sell Coca-Cola, and people that buy it and consume it. Okay, so that's on one end. Think of that as like a pure good or service that's traded on the market. And then on the other end, you have, financial instruments, stocks, bonds, options, real estate. Real estate kind of falls somewhere in the middle, right? But on the very far end, opposite of supply and demand for goods and services, you have financial assets. And these tend to follow a certain pattern. I'm not going to get into the pattern, but the pattern has to do with, it basically leads to an overvaluation. Money kind of crowds into, some sort of particular financial asset, and then there's a liquidation problem, and then the assets collapse until there's, new money comes in and catches it. Think of it like that. And then think of this as like a spectrum. So on one end is bread or Coca-Cola, and the other end is financial assets. And then things like oil are kind of, on that spectrum. They're a commodity, and so there's supply and demand kind of things that you have to consider. But there's also just the financialization of it. Okay? Housing is similar. People live in houses. People build and sell houses. There's people that buy and live in houses, right? And so there's a supply and demand element to that, but there's also a financialization element to that. In the news recently, we've been hearing how, Trump is kind of conflicted about the expense of housing. While he wants to help young people with affordable housing, he wants to protect older people who have all their money tied up in housing. And if you go listen to somebody like Saifedean Ammous, he says that, and I think he's right, that the reason this happens, the reason people buy a house to put their money in, their savings, is because there's no other good savings. You can't put your money in dollars because the government's printing it all the time and undermining the value of it. And at least if you have a house, that somebody might want to buy it in the future, and it's going to go up as the money value goes down, right? So you just have to remember that when people talk about the supply or stocks or the demand of stocks, they're not really talking about supply and demand. They're talking about a financialization of something that happens on the market. Okay. Now, why did I bring all that up? Well, because in this financialization end of the spectrum, you have things like you have bid and ask pricing. So anything that's sold on a market has a price that the seller is asking for, and then there's the buyer that's bidding on something lower. So the buyer bids low, and the seller asks high, right? And you meet in the middle, and that's where the market clears. And so what happened in the silver market is you first had what they call margin increases. So for example, if you trade, and I know I'm getting in the weeds, but I think it's necessary to explain some of this stuff. If you trade silver, the silver contract, you have to trade one silver contract, you have to have so much money in your account. And these are mostly fixed numbers, like a certain percentage, okay? So if the contract's worth $100,000, you might have to have, $10,000 in your account to trade a silver contract. And that's if you hold it overnight, or maybe you have to have even more. Maybe you have to have $100,000. I don't know what the exact margin requirements are, but there are people participating in the silver market, the gold market, the oil market, all these different markets, and they have to have a certain amount of money in their account in order to trade these positions. Well, what these exchanges did is they increased the amount of money that you have to hold those positions. So if you're holding a bunch of silver long, okay, you don't actually have the physical silver, you just hold some contract that's traded on the market. What happened is the exchanges came in and said, well, you have to hold more money now. Now, what this did is it forced people to sell their contracts. Maybe not at the price they wanted to, they just had to get out of the market because they weren't putting up any more money. That's one thing. The other thing is the bid and the ask have been spreading. So the spread between what the buyer wants and what the seller is willing to sell for, that amount has been spreading. So all this created what's called a liquidity trap, and essentially silver crashed. And there's a lot of speculation that JP Morgan was behind this, and some the COMEX was behind this, and the LVMH was behind this, and these different institutions that quote unquote safeguard these markets. And so the reason I bring all that up is because people are speculating that there's something wrong with the financial system and that the government is trying to move us into something other than the dollar or something digital or something else. And there's a lot of speculation about what that is. And so Whitney Webb is going to talk a little bit about that today. So I gave you all that background. I don't think she brings any of that stuff up, but I wanted to make clear that, supply and demand, as you think you know it, doesn't apply to financial markets. Okay? There's no such thing as supply and demand in the financial markets. That's a physical thing that happens with physical products and physical services that people provide. And it's an important thing to understand because, this has an effect. The financialization of things has an effect of kind of increasing asset prices over time. And then people borrow against those asset prices. And as they borrow more and more and more money is created. The asset prices go up even more. And it's this vicious loop. And eventually, it's not sustainable and it comes back down to some sort of reality. And so she's going to talk about crisis here. Well, how does the government create a crisis? Well, they do it exactly as I just described. They create a bunch of credit that creates new money. That new money flows into assets. The asset values go up. People start to believe that they're wealthy, okay? Even though they're really not. They're wealthy on paper, but they're not wealthy. This is why a wealth tax is just completely unconstitutional. But this is why people kind of behave that way. This is why they think, oh, well, my 401k, I've got $3 million in my 401k. I'm rich, not understanding that their 401k could, go from 4 million to 1 million pretty quickly, pretty easily, actually. So with that background, let's jump into Whitney Webb. I want to comment on some of the stuff she's talking about and just visit with you guys here about this, because I think this is good stuff. And if nothing else, I want you to know who Whitney Webb is and the types of things she's talking about.
You'll have the Fed, the central bank, working with the private banks that own the Fed in the United States. The partnership between them will be the system. It's not going to be all public. It's not going to be all private. It is a partnership. If you're using these existing dollar peg stable coins, those are already here. They're already on blockchains. And a lot of those phases that would take the Fed a few years have already been accomplished if you choose to use those. And if you regulate them so that they have to keep their reserves at the Fed.
All right, real quickly, I just want to make a comment here that anytime you hear, remember, this show is about liberty and property and freedom and things like that, right? So anytime you hear public-private partnership, what you're basically hearing is a proposal for people that are connected to government to be a part of the solution and get rich, probably at your expense. Okay. Now I know that seems cynical, but this is the way it works. If the government wants to do something, it could do it directly, but we all know that government doesn't do things very well, right? So what they do is they get cronies to do it. And they create some sort of law that allows the crony some privilege in some particular area, and the cronies get rich at your expense, the taxpayer. And so I just want to point out that anytime you hear the word public-private partnership, just your spidey senses need to go up, because that is telling you that it's going to cost you a whole lot of money and somebody else is going to get rich at your expense. This is not a free market thing, okay? This is not capitalism. This is cronyism. This is fascism. This is mercantilism. It's anything but free market and capitalism, okay? It's some other ism. Probably some mix of capitalism fascism and mercantilism is kind of what I think it is. But the point is it's not free and it's not a market. It's kind of contrived and controlled, and it's so that the parasites that steal from us they can survive, and they can survive at your expense. And these cronies in the market help them do that. And what they get out of it is they get to be rich. So just be on the lookout for something like this. I mean, this is where we need to kind of put our foot down and say no, right? But it's difficult because there's probably going to be a crisis. There's probably going to be a lot of scrambling around. It's going to be chaotic, and they're going to come in and they're say, we're from the government and we're here to help. That's kind of their deal. So let's continue here with Whitney Webb.
I think it's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC or this type of digital currency system is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event. I think the immigration crises, any sort of refugee situation, that's going to be used to push for digital IDs. I think it's just a very easy excuse for them, a way for them to quickly manufacture consent. Because, all these people, we don't know who they are. They could be criminals. They could be anybody. We have to know who everybody is. And it's going to be sold as a way to provide security to the insecurity created by the migrant crisis. So I think there's been growing awareness for some time that there's a lot of bipartisan consensus about most of the policies of the U.S. government, like endless war, for example. And some people refer to it as the uniparty. But people also forget that too. And so what a lot of people call this the two-party model, people refer to it sometimes as the left-right paradigm. But I think not a lot of people truly understand how that paradigm works. If you think about it as the left hand and right hand of the establishment, you'll have one of those hands create a problem intentionally. And then the opposing hand comes in and offers the solution. But the solution was always what the establishment wanted, but it's sold as a solution to a problem created by the other side. So it creates the illusion that the opposing force solved a problem, but in reality, the problem was manufactured by one hand of the system, and then the solution was offered by the other hand.
Yeah, this is something we've talked about on this program, that this battle, this kind of contrived battle between the left and the right, the Republicans and the Democrats, this is fake, basically. Okay, there are people, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Council on Foreign Relations. This is not a conspiracy theory, right? This is a real group of people that convene from time to time and talk about policy and how to implement policy and how to get certain politicians on board and things like that. Now, there's the Trilateral Commission and there's these other things I know less about. But the Council on Foreign Relations is very much a real thing. And this is where these elites kind of hang out and congregate. And they're on the left and the right. Okay, so what they do is in front of the cameras, they yell at you about the left is communist, and the left tells you that the right is fascist, and they're all about their corporate buddies and this kind of thing. And the left says the right is trying to kill all the kids, and just all this kind of stuff. This fight is theater, okay, and it's mostly there to try to create this illusion, because what they're going to do is they're going to manufacture a narrative. This happened, by the way, let me just say, this happened during the creation of the Federal Reserve. If you go read The Creature from Jekyll Island, or you could go listen to G. Edward Griffin talk about it on YouTube, but he's the author of the book. This meeting happened in secret, and they secretly had other people advocate for the opposite thing. Like, in other words, they secretly advocated for the opposite, for the non-passage of the Federal Reserve Act, to make it appear like they were for that, when they were the ones that actually created the Federal Reserve Act. Okay. And then they also did things like they brought in Teddy Roosevelt to create a wedge, because Wilson wasn't going to get reelected. He wasn't going to get elected. He was losing to the Republican, and I forgot who the Republican was. But they brought in this other, party member, Theodore Roosevelt, to run, to split the difference and elevate Woodrow Wilson to the presidency, who they knew would sign the Federal Reserve Act. So all this stuff happens in the background to manipulate the public into thinking that oh yeah, we killed the Federal Reserve Act, or we did this, or we did, the Republicans did this and the Democrats did that. And this is all just part of the narrative that they create to manipulate us. That's why I say it's not about voting. Okay. It's not about voting for Republicans or voting for Democrats. Neither of these parties are for you. Okay. They're for their elite constituency that pays for their election campaigns and all this kind of stuff. So it's this whole voting thing is just a tool that they use to make you feel like that you were part of it, that we are the government. You'll hear people say that from time to time. We are the government. What are you talking about, Seth? We are the government. No, we're not the government. That's an illusion. Okay. And so that's what she's talking about when she's talking about this left-right paradigm, that people misunderstand this and they think they understand it, but they really don't. And it's very damaging to us, especially when they, intentionally break something and then have the other party present, a solution that just further enslaves us, which is typically what happens. All right, let's continue.
The man that claims to have created CBDCs is a man from Barbados named Oliver Gale. He created one of the first, arguably the first CBDC project in the Caribbean, and then went on to have a key role in creating the Nigerian CBDC, the e-Naira. So the way the CBDC in Nigeria was set up is that in order to access the CBDC, you have to have a national identification number, which is the Nigerian digital ID project. So you have to have a digital ID in order to be able to access the Nigerian CBDC. And the way they tried to get people to onboard to the CBD system was by essentially cutting off the vast majority of the cash in circulation in Nigeria. And so despite the fact that they created these conditions to coerce people into using the CBDC, the populace resists. And that suggests that the idea of CBDCs being a tool for financial inclusion, the public doesn't seem to believe that, right? In Nigeria, these people that ostensibly suffer from this identity gap, the financial inclusion that they're being offered by the CBDC. They don't see any real benefit. They see it as a tool of the state. And the state in Nigeria and in other African countries where, these sort of systems are being rolled out, the governments have abused these systems to go after journalists or other people and violate human rights and all sorts of things. So it's not a tool for increased human rights. It's not a tool for increased inclusion. It's inherently exclusionary, and it's a surveillance tool. So if Nigeria's tactic of, drastically reducing the amount of cash in circulation didn't work, then I think it's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event.
Okay. There's a couple things I want to point out there. The first thing is, notice that these things that are rolled out to us in the United States, these things that the elites talk about, the politicians talk about, what they're doing is they're testing these ideas in other places. And that way we're not paying attention. Like, we don't care. I don't care what's going on in Nigeria. What the hell are you telling them? Why, Seth, why are you talking to me about what's going on in Nigeria? Okay. Well, the reason we're talking to you about what's going on in Nigeria is because those are test cases. The United Nations is very involved in all this stuff. They're part of, the Council on Foreign Relations, and there's people. These people are all. It's an infestation of parasites, and they exist in the United Nations. They exist in Council on Foreign Relations. They exist in the political system. They exist in the elite class, the NGO class, the permanent government class, which is the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon and all these things. These are the parasites, okay? And you may say to me, well, Seth, look, I'm in the Army, I pay taxes. Yeah, but if you take what you pay minus what you pay in taxes, what you get paid, excuse me. Let's say I don't know what you get paid in the Army. Let's say you get paid $75K in the Army, okay? Maybe you don't, but that's kind of the median income, right? So $75K you get paid in the Army, and you pay $20 in taxes. Well, that still means that I'm paying $55,000 for you to be in the Army. So no, you're not paying taxes. That's a net loss to the taxpayer. So, and I realize this may be very unpopular with some of you, what I'm saying, that that you're part of the parasitic class. Even if you don't know you are. And this is just something we've enabled. But just recognize that these aren't grassroots ideas. The idea, of America, if you think about it, is, okay, the people get together and we decide we want this or that. I don't know if you remember the Tea Party movement, but Nancy Pelosi was running around, this is an AstroTurf movement, this is not grassroots. And the irony is the Tea Party was actually grassroots, and every other thing that you've been told that is grassroots is actually not grassroots. So it's just kind of one of these ironical kind of deals that goes on in government. But the other thing is she talks about here is the people didn't accept it. Okay. And this is kind of one of the features of money, actually, is people tend to accept money that they can trust and trust that one, it's not going to be debauched, but also trust that they can turn around and trade it away for something in the future. That's one of the features of money, a real money. Now, you may say, well, the dollar's not a real money, it's fiat money. Yeah, but because of the legal tender laws, because the rules that the government passes, it says, you can pay your taxes in fiat money. These are all things that shore up, the dollar in the United States and around the world. But kind of a market function of money is, will people keep it? Is there demand for it? Will they hold it? Does it preserve the value, its purchasing value over time? These are all features of money. So notice that people rejected this. And if you think about what the problem with money is, it's the fact that governments and institutions can just create more of it at will. That's what fiat means, is at will. And so anytime the U.S. government wants to create more money, it just borrows $1 trillion. Poof, a trillion brand new dollar bills are created in the market. That's how they do it. And so I think people see this, CBDC or tokenization of money as just another way. It's the same thing, but instead of paper, it's worse, right? Because you can't put it in your wallet and hold it, and you can't trade, incognito, so to speak. So in some ways, it's the same thing, but worse. Not the same thing, but better. Okay. And people see that, right? So they're like, nah, we're not going to use that. What if the electricity goes down? How do I use this electronic money? What if I lose my phone service? How do I buy anything? You see, I mean, the whole point of money is it's supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to use it under any scenario, under any circumstance. Well, if you lose electricity or you lose your phone service, the whole CBDC thing goes out the window. So it's kind of one of the problems with Bitcoin too. A lot of people say in a modern society, it's not a problem, but I don't know, man. Chaotic things can happen. Electricity can go down. And, if you cut people off without food for a week or two, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, you got a real problem on your hands. So, yeah, I think the CBDC thing, I think people see it as like, this is a problem. Now, if they put a gun to your head and say, you're going to use this or else I'm going to pull the trigger, well, then, yeah, I guess I'm going to use it, kind of thing. But in other words, that recognize that's force. That's not, that's not us voluntarily accepting their new money. That's them telling us we're going to use it or else you can go live in this jail cell. Okay. So anyway, those are, this is what's great about Whitney Webb is she brings up these things. Now she doesn't bring them up, she's not banging the liberty drum like I am all the time, but she does bring these up because she is someone who's focused on liberty. But I think her methodology is to describe some of these things in a real practical way so that people, can understand it and resist it. All right, let's continue.
Where people will be made an offer they can't refuse, essentially. Whatever that crisis is that creates this situation where people will have, very little choice but to onboard to this new digital currency system, it could manifest in a number of ways, but regardless of how it manifests, what the narrative is going to be is that privacy is dangerous, anonymity is dangerous, specifically financial privacy is dangerous. Those are going to be the narratives that come out of this event, and that's going to be a way to force onboarding both onto digital currency that can be tracked to stop terror financing or things of that nature. And also we have to know who everybody online is, or we have to know who everybody is interacting with these systems. We need digital ID. It's very much tied up with efforts to regulate the internet. The effort to regulate the internet, specifically in the United States, has been going on for years. Under the Obama administration, they called it the driver's license for the internet. The idea is to have a government-issued ID be necessary for you to access the internet. And in doing so, they know not just what you're posting and saying online, they know what information you're reading online as well. But the difference is, once it's directly connected to a government-issued ID, they could prosecute you for things like publishing misinformation and all of that. And there's actually been pushes from people like former Google CEO Eric Schmidt to punish people who publish alleged disinformation, and that the need that it's necessary to have IDs connected to social media accounts and to people's internet access as a means of facilitating those kinds of arrests or, law enforcement activity. Well,
okay. So one thing I just want to ask here is, does that sound like freedom? Does that sound like freedom to you? It doesn't sound like freedom to me. And I always kind of go back to, we'll get to the narrative thing in a second. I think that's important. But the narrative around America is it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. Okay. Well, who are we talking about? When we talk about the land of the free and the home of the brave, who is it exactly we're talking about? We're talking about the people. We're talking about you and me, right? Unless there's some hidden meaning in that, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about you and me, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so I just want to ask you, does that sound like freedom to you? What she's talking about? Making us an offer, creating some sort of chaotic situation, and then making us an offer we can't refuse. To me, it sounds like some gangster shit. That's what it sounds like to me. It doesn't sound like, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so for me, I always just kind of go back to freedom is not one of these things where you're like almost free or mostly free or 90% free. Freedom is, to me, is you're either free or you're not free. Okay. It's not something you compromise with. It's like, there's a famous saying, and I can't remember who said it. I apologize. But there's a famous saying that, any compromise between food and poison results in death. Okay. Well, that's like freedom. Any compromise you make in the area of freedom makes you less free. Okay. It's just logic. And so I think Americans specifically are going to have to contemplate this idea of freedom a little bit more carefully when we go through some sort of chaotic situation, created, contrived chaotic situation. We're going to have to really stick to our guns, so to speak, and not accept some solution that is presented as a solution to a created problem. Okay. Now, the other thing she talked about is narratives. What will the narrative be? The narrative will be, these people online, they're dangerous. They're saying misinformation. They're talking disinformation. A lie can travel all the way around the world before you have a chance to refute it. All these kinds of talking points. And this is all designed to get us comfortable with the idea of, we really need you to get an ID so you can access the internet. You're really going to have to get an ID. We just can't have people on the internet that don't have an ID. We can have people vote. This is the irony of the whole thing. You can have people vote that don't have an ID, because not everybody can get an ID. Have you seen these, by the way, videos where they go to the man on the street and they ask black people, do you have a driver's license? And they go, yeah, sure. Do you know any other people that don't have driver's license? No, everybody I know has a driver's license. Are you familiar with the fact that politicians in this country think it's hard for blacks to get a driver's license? And they just laugh. They're like, what are they talking about? But this is just a narrative. This is not even true. This is not even close to true. This is just something they say to kind of begin to condition people to something they want to do. And we're all going to have to start seeing government in this way, okay? It's not enough for me to see it this way, okay? It's just not enough. I'm just one person. The vast majority don't need to see government this way, but 15 to 20% of the population absolutely needs to see government this way if we're going to do anything about any of these initiatives. But these narratives, as she talked about, these are contrived. These are just made up. These are things they already want. These are things that they already have in the incubator ready to go. Okay? So as soon as the crisis happens, it's going to be, it's terrorism. There's people online that we don't know, and we need to harden these systems, and there's misinformation and disinformation. You're going to have to give up some of your freedom in order to be safe. That's just what we're going to have to do. And there's going to be kind of this come to Jesus kind of explanation of all this. We saw this after 9/11. We have the Patriot Act. It's supposed to just be temporary. Hey, these are only temporary measures. Once we get everything back to stability, then we'll remove these powers. We'll make sure that we give these powers back to the people. No, never happens. Never happens. Never happened in history. It hasn't happened since I've been alive. You just say no. Just do the Nancy Reagan thing. Just say no, right? All right, let's continue with Whitney Webb here.
There's a couple of reasons why I think they'd want to have private banks have like a major role in this digital currency system to come. If there's a private sector entity banking you and managing your money, it's much easier for them to bank you than the federal government. So for example, if the Federal Reserve were to do a direct issue CBDC, it would be harder for them to freeze someone's bank account or debank them in any sort of significant way, as opposed to a private company where you have, for example, precedents where JP Morgan Chase, for example, debanked Dr. Mercola and some of his executives and didn't give any reason as to why. They just said, we can no longer provide you with financial services. No questions asked. That would be very hard to do in the case of a direct issued CBDC. This is something similar to the argument that's been made for social media companies censoring. They say, oh, but they're private companies, so they can restrict speech however they want. But we know now that their restrictions on private speech have been a result of public sector pressure. So again, people need to keep in mind that this is a public-private partnership. That's the prevailing model in the United States. The digital dollar in the United States is also going to be a public-private model. You'll have the Fed, the central bank, working with the private banks that own the Fed in the United States. And that will be the partnership between them will be the system. It's not going to be all public. It's not going to be all private. It is a partnership.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about this because this is subtle and it's important. The reason the government opts for these public-private partnerships is because if the government was to debank you, for example, the Federal Reserve just says, now I know people say the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's owned by these member banks. Yes, technically on paper, but trust me, if if our money was being issued directly by the Federal Reserve to us as citizens or banking us, and we were removed from that banking system, there would be outcries. Okay. There would be, the government can't do this. What about equal protection under the law? This is a constitutional violation of my rights, blah, 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 blah. Okay. The reason they like these public-private partnerships is they can get the private companies to do it. What's a private company, Seth? If JP Morgan doesn't want you as a customer, I can't aim a gun at JP Morgan and force them to bank you. Okay. So it's just a convenient way of taking dissidents and moving them out of the system without all the constitutional, problems. We saw this with Twitter back before Elon Musk bought it. The Twitter files, Michael Schellenberg and Matt Taibbi and all these guys. We did a show on this. Go back and, I don't know what number it was, but go back and listen to it. We basically found out once Elon Musk bought the company that these guys were working with the FBI. The government had a seat in their office. and was asking him questions like, why is this guy still on the internet? Why is he still talking? You got to remember this was during COVID, and they were trying to corral everybody into this narrative for whatever reason. I mean, we could speculate on what that reason was, and there were just dissidents out there talking on the internet, talking on Twitter at the time. And there were people that worked in government that were talking to the leadership at Twitter and saying, is this person still allowed to speak on your platform? Shut them down. I mean, that happened. Okay. And then there were people too that said, at the time, there were people that said, well, Twitter's a private company. They can have whoever they want on their platform. And then, of course, we find out later that the government's behind it, right? So this is, this is some of the tricky shit that they do to implement the things that they want to implement. But just know that if it's public-private, if it's private-public partnership, it's basically government. And it's almost worse than just government, because there's going to be a handful of people that get rich off the backs of you and me by being complicit in it. So, yeah, that's not good.
Using these existing dollar peg stablecoins, those are already here. They're already on blockchains. And a lot of those phases that would take the Fed a few years have already been accomplished if you choose to use those. And if you regulate them so that they have to keep their reserves at the Fed, then you're able to sort of have the same kind of system, but you don't have to go through the process of creating a direct issued CBDC. China, for example, they already have their CBDC. So the US is behind. So to remain competitive, they say, and have a first mover advantage, we should go with the digital dollars that are already here. So that's dollar peg stable coins. The banks that are involved in this new system, it's very unlikely it's going to be the existing banks we have in the US right now. And that's because just like in 2008 and more recently with the Silicon Valley banking crisis, every time there's a major financial crisis, there seems to be a major bank consolidation wave. And you have Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, saying during the Silicon Valley bank crisis, in front of Congress, that they are essentially only going to rescue systemically important banks, which is a designator that Yellen can just, she essentially decides who's a bank worth saving and who's not. And this is sort of so one indication the system is being rolled out in this way is looking at the people developing the infrastructure and what type of digital currencies they're supporting. So one of the biggest developers right now of CBDCs is this company called R3 that's backed by some of the biggest Wall Street banks in the world. And they were named by Central Banking Magazine as the CBDC Partner of the Year last year. And then they're developing a litany of CBDCs for countries all around the world. That's just one part of what they do. They have this thing they call a digital currency accelerator. And the three types of digital currencies R3 develops are CBDCs, stable coins, and tokenized deposit tokens. And some banks in the US have already rolled out deposit tokens. Citigroup, JP Morgan. JP Morgan actually had a research paper out last year about how CBDCs are inferior to deposit tokens and how deposit tokens are better. So Oliver Gale, who defines himself as the founder of CBDCs, has more recently co-founded a company called Fluent Finance. What Fluent Finance is, they attempt to create a trustworthy dollar peg stablecoin that they call US Plus. And it's sort of framed as an answer to dollar peg stablecoins like Tether that have been controversial for having opaque reserves. So the whole thing about US Plus is having trackable reserves in real time and all of this. And so it's an attempt to create a very extremely trustworthy and backed by a consortium of banks, a bank-led US dollar peg stablecoin.
All right. There's a lot of detail here, and Whitney Webb, that's her trademark. She gets into the details. You ought to go look at some of her stuff on Epstein. It's amazing. The details and the grasp of facts that this woman has is it's unbelievable, really. But those details don't matter so much, okay? Because at the end of the day, notice what she said. In order to have a stable coin, you have to have your reserves at the Fed. Well, what are reserves? Reserves are just dollars. They're dollars in U.S. treasuries, or they're dollars held in deposit, or whatever, okay? The problem is the dollar. It's the fiat nature of the dollar. It's the fact that the government can just create it. This is what is constantly eroding your standard of living. We show that in there's a Fred chart that shows how productivity and wages tracked, just perfectly tracked for the longest time. My camera screwed up. Sorry, y'all. And the that wages and productivity tracked perfectly for the longest time. And then magically, in August of 1971, when we went off the gold exchange standard, in other words, we closed the window that allowed foreign countries to, these foreign countries were holding us to the account, right? But what we did is we started spending way too much money in the 60s. The dollars in issuance far began to exceed the amount of gold that we had in reserves, and then countries, namely France, came and said, "Hey, we have a whole bunch of dollars here. We're going to give them to you. We'd like for you to send the gold over to us," right? And so Nixon closed the gold window, and ever since then, productivity and wages have been diverging. Productivity continues to rise because technology continues to improve and all this. But the wage earner, the person earning a wage, has been undermined by this process, and which makes their standard of living more and more difficult over time. A wage earner has to make more and more in wages in order to keep up with the cost of living, the standard of living. And this is very simple. And it doesn't matter if you just call everything a stable coin now, as if somehow calling it stable is going to make it stable. The fact that they can create more, and that the banking system, just the banking system alone, every time you go to the bank, and let's say you borrow $200,000 to buy a house, the bank doesn't have the $200,000. So when they create the loan, that creates the $200,000 that goes to the builder of the house. That money is newly created. So the banking system itself is undermining your productivity, your ability to not just earn your productivity, but to hold on to it over time. They just steal it away in inflation. So all these details, Tether and stablecoin and deposit tokens and all these things, these are just shiny objects in the game of how do we hold on to the power of the printing press. Maybe we're not printing it anymore. It's just ones and zeros in a computer. But how do we hold on to that power? How do we keep it in the United States of America, for example? Now, the other thing she pointed out that I want to bring up, what was it? All right, let's just jump back into Whitney Webb's presentation and come back on the other side. We're almost done. We're going to wrap up the show here probably after this next segment.
So if the inventor of CBDCs is moving into stablecoins, he probably knows that there's something there. So one thing that gets overlooked a lot with Cyber Polygon and some of these other related simulations about coming cyber attacks is that they seem to involve the big banks. And some of them even involve central banks. There's a major theme of banking here, which I think has been unfortunately overlooked, and it sort of implies that one of these cyber attacks of the cyber pandemic will be on the financial system to some degree. So for example, if you look at Cyber Polygon, it was the WWII, but it was done in partnership with Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and was one of the opening speakers of it was the Russian prime minister, things like that, which is in direct contrast, for example, to the supposed Russian hacker narrative that's.
All right, again, we're getting into the weeds, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. But what I want to say from the last segment is, and even this cyber, whatever it's called, these are crony companies, okay? These are companies like Palantir. These companies are very closely tied to government. And their business model is do stuff for the government that takes liberty from you and me and forces us into some market crony kind of market situation that that we don't necessarily want to be a part of, but they force us to be a part of. Okay, so this company R3, this Poly Saigon or whatever it was called, these are all crony companies. They're not participating in the market in the way that your company probably does where you work, or the company does where I work. Okay, we're out every day earning customers' trust and getting their money to do something of value for them to make money. Okay, we're not connected to government, and just going forward, we really should be on the lookout for this. We should, I don't know, I feel like we should almost shame people for either working directly for the government, or worse yet, getting rich because you're somehow connected to the government. I think that's just so wrong and un-American. We shouldn't be okay with that. And so I'm for, basically ostracizing people that earn their income that way and making it known that, hey, you're living off me. I just think that's wrong. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed Whitney Webb. I think she is definitely a leader in this subject, along with Epstein. And you should go follow her, read her stuff, read her books. That One Nation Under Blackmail is very good. 2-volume series, very dense. I mean, but it's a page turner, man. I mean, it's like reading a novel. It's just, you can't wait to see what happens next in that thing, because it's just so insanely crazy. All right, with that, thank you guys for coming in. Thanks for listening. Share the show. If you haven't yet, come in and listen to an episode or two on YouTube. That'll help the algorithm drive a few more people to the show. But however you listen, come back in a few days and we'll have another episode for you on Who Gets to Decide. All right, everybody, I'm out. Peace.